We now know that domestic violence can come in many forms, and one of those is coercive control, an insidious pattern of behaviour that undermines a person's sense of self and sometimes their sanity. But it's a little understood by many people and even harder to police under current laws. In an exclusive provided to The Drum, DV perpetrators could be jailed for up to 10 years under proposed new coercive control laws set to be introduced to New South Wales Parliament next week. Now, the bill being put forward by the state opposition, not the government, but it's the first attempt by a major party on the Australian mainland to criminalise the dangerous behaviours underpinning many abusive relationships.
Coercive control is sometimes referred to as intimate terrorism. But what does it actually look like?
Can mean anything from cutting off money, locking women in the house, telling a woman what she can eat and when she can eat it.
Being constantly humiliated and insulted, their behaviours designed to undermine the victim and give the perpetrator a sense of control. A survey of 15,000 women in Australia found nearly 6% had experienced coercive control from a current or former partner in the early months of the COVID crisis, with 1 in 5 saying it was for the first time.
It's been an absolute breeding ground because people have been trapped at home with their abusers.
But it's not a new problem. The murder of Hannah Clark and her 3 children by Hannah's estranged partner in February renewed calls for a law change.
He would sulk and not speak for days. He would threaten to kill himself, go through her phone, through her handbag.
In New South Wales, a coroner's review of intimate partner homicides found 99% of perpetrators had committed coercive and controlling behaviours toward the victim. And Shellharbour MP and opposition whip Anna Watson hopes to change that by criminalising coercive control behaviours.
I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think it could save lives.
The draft bill still needs to get the final tick of approval from her party, but has the support of Labor leader Jodie Mackay and opposition spokeswoman on women and the prevention of domestic and family violence, Trish Doyle, who spoke of her own experience of family violence in her maiden speech to Parliament.
The night becomes one of ambulances, police, sobbing, fear.
Under Labor's proposal, coercive control behaviours, including emotional and financial abuse, could find the perpetrator jailed for up to 5 years.
It lists a number of behaviours that need to be proven and proven as part of a pattern.
Perpetrators could face 10 years behind bars for aggravated coercive control, which would include the abuse of a child. Labor says it covers all intimate partners, from extended family members to exes. And they say this bill goes further than Tasmania, which made changes to criminalise the behaviours in 2005.
The New South Wales version will be, a tweak on what has worked best in the Scottish model and the Tasmanian model.
In a statement, the New South Wales Attorney-General told The Drum that in considering any new laws, caution would be needed so you didn't overreach in your endeavour in criminalising behaviour. He said the government had no immediate plans to follow suit, saying he's still reviewing overseas jurisdictions, including Scotland, which is considered the gold standard for criminalising coercive behaviour. There, in 1 year, more than 1,000 charges were brought under the Act and 96% of reported charges were prosecuted.
Their legislation has a much higher maximum penalty to account for the seriousness of this type of abuse, but also they specify some of the behaviours that constitute coercive control, which really helps reinforce for police and prosecutors what they should be looking for.
I've heard from some folks in Australia making these arguments, this is criminalising the family, this is not, this is just about people behaving badly. All of those arguments that hold no water as far as I'm concerned.
Peak domestic violence body Women's Safety today released its own position paper. Labor says many, but not all of the 12 recommendations have been included within their draft bill.
You've got frontline specialists that are calling for this. You've got victim survivors calling for this in unison. It's something that we just need to roll up our sleeves and get done.
And that report from Stephanie Bolchi. Now, for more on this, we're joined by journalist and author of See What You Made Me Do, Power, Control and Domestic Violence, Jess Hill. Jess, welcome back to The Drum.
Thanks, Julia.
Now, you've advocated for some time and quite strongly for the need for coercive control legislation. Tell us why you think it's so important.
Because the way that the criminal justice system is set up at the moment is that it looks for incidents. And what we know about domestic abuse is that it's not about particular or specific incidents, it's about a system of abuse. So everything from isolation, micromanagement of activities, degradation, threats, gaslighting. And inside that system of abuse, physical and sexual violence may occur or it may not occur. And at the moment, the criminal justice system is really looking only for those incidents in which physical or sexual violence occurs. But when they go to, prosecute, say, destruction of property or an assault, they miss everything that has gone on before and around that assault, and therefore they miss how dangerous that perpetrator could really be.
Now, one of the dominant things that critics say about this kind of legislation is that you're going to criminalise behaviour that might be, I don't know, nasty or dominating or just a jealous person. What's the response to that? How do you establish actual patterns of behaviour that can be potentially dangerous?
Well, I'd like them to actually sit in a courtroom and see what kind of incidents actually get past the criminal justice system and get prosecuted.
Give us some examples, Jess.
So an example of something that was prosecuted in Scotland was there was a man who was threatening to kill his wife. Now, it was so serious that she barricaded herself inside her bedroom, and outside he was sharpening knives. He'd confiscated the phone so she couldn't contact anyone. So he was prosecuted. There's no threat at all of criminalising just normal but unpleasant behaviour. The sorts of things that we see being prosecuted in Scotland and England and Wales are really serious ongoing systems of abuse in which there are things like isolating a person from friends and family, threats to harm or kill, threats to hurt a child, criminal destruction of property, micromanagement and surveillance using online communication tools or spyware. But you've got to prove at least 2 or more incidents that are like discrete incidents within the system of coercive control. And it is really, like, the bar is set quite high. A reasonable person has to see that that behaviour would cause somebody else fear, alarm or distress. And so, I mean, the sorts of stuff we're seeing prosecuted are the things that were hiding behind minor acts of violence within the relationship. So, for example, I was in a courtroom the other day and there was a man who was being prosecuted for destroying 3 pot plants. He'd come home from work, he was on his laptop, his wife was apparently getting annoyed about that. She took the laptop outside and then he destroyed 3 pot plants. That's all we hear about that incident. We have no clue as to whether outside of that he has been controlling, threatening, demeaning, surveilling her. And so all that happens is you get judged on the seriousness of that incident alone. Right. But what coercive control legislation does is it says, look, let's look at the entire arc of the relationship and see what part that incident played within a greater scheme of behaviour. Right, which is some things that happen when we talk about, that can happen in the media as well. When we look at what happened with Hannah Clark, people were very quickly talking about the actual incident without seeing and understanding properly patterns of behaviour that had built up to it. But I want to bring Amani Haydar in at this point. Amani, you've spoken and written powerfully before about growing up in a household where you witnessed your father behave abusively towards your mother, and she eventually died at his hands. Was this a situation of coercive control?
Yes, I think it was, and perhaps the reason these things are so difficult for people outside of the relationship to identify is the fact that they can be quite insidious, cumulative, and can take place in through the use of emotional and psychological tactics that can really only target the victim. So my mum was a social worker and a counsellor and gradually learned to describe her experiences. And she would say that she was being controlled and gaslighted. And I think she experienced a lot of frustration about the fact that it was hard for other people to see that. For me, when the murder took place, it came as a huge shock initially because I was looking at it as an isolated incident, because in my mind and the assumptions that I had learned from the world around me, abuse was always physical. And it was hard for me to connect the dots and see that this was part of a bigger pattern. Do you think that this legislation would have helped your mother
has saved her?
Definitely. I think laws like this provide women with a language with which to express their experiences, and they provide the law with a way to respond. So perhaps if we were having more robust conversations about the nature of coercive control earlier on, and perhaps if we had these mechanisms in place, people like my mum might consider leaving relationships sooner. They might be able to identify the abuse more readily, and they might even put in place some more robust safety planning measures when they decide to leave.
Tori, do you think that we've basically normalised a lot of coercive controlling behaviours?
Well, I think, yeah, in many cases we have. I mean, you know, you get maybe younger women entering into a relationship and they don't recognise the red flags. They maybe think that it's just, you know, oh, it's sweet that he's really, you know, he cares about what I'm doing every minute of the day.
Right. It's supposed to be romantic, right?
Yeah, it's supposed to be romantic, and don't realise that that is a red flag and see that develop. So, yeah, being able to name this, I think, is really, really important. I think the legislation helps you start to do that, to unpick it, and also, I guess, bring to light the myriad ways in which this can come out. I mean, I remember we had conversations here years ago in South Australia about expanding domestic violence laws to include cruelty to pets, and people like, what? You know, what does that mean? But you start to then look at specific cases, for example, where a man might say, you know, you do that again and the dog gets it, and you can start to tease it out. So for victims, that I think is extraordinary, because gaslighting is very much a part of this, that they think, I'm going crazy, you know, it's all in my head, and this will help to bring it out into the open.
Jackie, how do you think we have a conversation about what constitutes a healthy relationship, given what so many women are saying about controlling behaviours that can start so young?
I think it has to start in schools. I don't think you're ever going to stop couples getting together. I mean, there are always going to be intimacy with couples, and I think that, you know, the fact that 80% of murder victims happen to be in a relationship.
But it's not about couples getting together, it's about victims identifying dangerous patterns of behaviour and avoiding them.
So what you're saying is this legislation is designed to start that conversation?
No, I'm saying we're having that conversation now.
Well, we are, because the legislation's brought up, but I'm not sold on the... I loved what Jess said. I'm not sold on the legislative solution, because the Scottish examples were clear. I mean, you know, he's outside sharpening knives, but you know, we're talking about over a long period of time other little things like, you know, the dog gets, you know, eats rat sack, or things get smashed and, you know, pot plants, but it's only a symbol of what was happening. So
it's part of a pattern.
Yeah, but for it to have got to that stage where she is so reliant and so subject to being gaslighted in such a fashion, it started out with a relationship, I would assume, that was quite healthy, or should have been red flagged from the start. And I think there are other legislation, I think, that will do it much better than trying to put a man in prison for 10 years for something he's been doing for 10 years. Do you know what I mean? You can almost...
What legislation are you thinking of as an alternative?
I'm thinking of going back to the old income splitting, and I think that's where women really miss out. They leave the workforce when they enter into a relationship, and once they leave the workforce, all power goes to the man. It's my car, it's my house, it's my, you know, and you're in a relationship with someone who believes that. What are your choices? Kids are involved, how do I get out?
You're saying financial independence is crucial, but you're worried, you're going back to the point of you're criminalising what you see as smaller actions.
Look, get a jury to convict, and given that the sentence is 10 years on this, how many convictions are you getting? It said it had 90% of convictions were prosecuted, but how many of them actually got a conviction?
Well, they're still, it's only just been introduced, so they're still waiting to track that.
So
we can bring Jess in on this point. Jess.
Yeah, look, I think Jackie's sort of trying to come to a point here. I really want to make the point that coercive control is not about just what a perpetrator does to their partner, but what they take away. And we're talking about extremely dangerous and damaging forms of behaviour that are tantamount to torture. That is how coercive control is recognised internationally. It doesn't just happen in relationships, it happens in cult situations, in prisoner of war situations. We're not just talking about bad behaviours. We're talking about times in which a woman's liberty may be entirely removed. She may be trapped inside the house. She may have her wages and benefits taken from her. She may have the right to drive taken away from her. It's the removal of her autonomy that makes her vulnerable to all of the things that a perpetrator then can do, which is to subject her to harassment and demeaning comments and reduce her self-esteem to a point where she may not be able to see herself in the mirror anymore and know who she is. This is such a dangerous form of abuse. It's the most dangerous form of domestic abuse. In 99% of homicides in New South Wales, coercive and controlling behaviour was there prior to the homicide. You know, this is the big red flag. We made strangulation a separate offence because we noticed that it was 8 times more likely that a woman would be killed if she was strangled by her partner. So we realised that that needs to have its own separate charge. And what I think we need to see with coercive control is that these like potential homicides, but also incredibly degrading and damaging situations are being done in plain sight because we can't see the cumulative effect of abuse, and all we can see are the physical incidents.
So I suppose I want to go back earlier in the relationship. So as soon as that female leaves the workforce and gives over control, that we go back to income splitting, but it must be shown that it's going into her account, and also that the employer has to make a provision out of that account to continue paying to her superannuation, so that all times in the marriage, if the male right from the start of the relationship wants to say it's mine, it's social. Your employer, everyone is saying it's not yours.
That's dealing with the assumption that it's only financial barriers that is preventing a woman from leaving, and not psychological, which can often come in the way when it comes to coercive control.
Often financial is one of the first to start that whole gaslighting.
I agree, and I agree with what Jackie's saying. You know, in the sense that financial abuse is absolutely key. It's actually more prevalent in these coercive controlling situations than physical violence. And it is the #1 reason that women are afraid to leave is their fear of destitution. But remember that a lot of these women are actually still employed. They have their wages and benefits taken from them. They can be defrauded of their money. They can have leases or certain credit cards signed up in their name fraudulently. I mean, what Jackie's suggesting is an interesting protective measure, but I think it's entirely separate to whether we criminalise coercive control and what comes as a result of that.
Amani, do you think there needs to be a shift attitudinally to the way we view relationships, more fundamentally, having kind of lived through what you've lived through?
I'd like to speak a little bit to the stuff that Jackie was saying. My mum had actually incrementally built herself a career and established an income for herself, and was actually quite successful in that regard. And victims exercise a lot of agency, even though they're being abused or even though they're being controlled. So I don't think it's right to erase the activities that they engage in to establish themselves, or to assume that necessarily they've given away that control at any point in the relationship. My mum was murdered in her house that she owned. She was paying the bills at that time, and essentially my father, perhaps an aspect of what happened was that he was freeloading at that time. So I think it's incorrect to sort of characterise it that way. In relation to thinking culturally and shifting our mindsets about what a healthy relationship should be, I've been in workshops and classrooms where the majority of students have actually indicated that they think that phone checking, regular monitoring of your whereabouts, and activities like that are a normal part of a relationship, and that are even romantic, and they've absorbed these ideas from adults and also from entertainment around them. So we do need to think outside of just criminalising behaviours, and we do need to think outside of legal and carceral responses. And at the same time, we need to be reimagining the way that we structure our society, as Jess said, so that we're not replicating abuse in other structures and systems.
Now, I just want to, but before we lose you, Jess, because we're almost out of time, I'm conscious that your book, See What You Made Me Do, which, won awards and was a bestseller in Australia, has now just come out in the US and in the UK. So you've kind of been looking at the research globally, which you've been doing for some time anyway. And coercive control is something that is just starting, as Steph Bolche pointed out in her piece, in a number of jurisdictions, for example, Scotland. What have you noticed about kind of cultural differences when it comes to thinking about domestic violence? Where does Australia stand in relation to those countries?
I think we have a really strong understanding of the gendered nature of this kind of abuse, and that's not to say that it doesn't happen in same-sex relationships. It's not to say that it is not perpetrated by females in some in same heterosexual relationships. But our understanding, I think, that it is essentially a gendered form of abuse, that it is something that is underpinned by patriarchy, both in the home but also in the systems that end up perpetuating it and too often end up colluding with the perpetrator. That is very strong in Australia, and that's been built by survivors, by the families of people who have been killed, by the sector workers who have been in this area for 40 plus years. So in a lot of ways, we're ahead of the game. I would say our understanding of coercive control is far, far behind the UK. And part of that is because when you introduce laws, you change culture, especially when you introduce laws with a good amount of fanfare and with the women's sector behind you and in front of you, collaborating on the laws. And what has happened in the UK is we've seen fictional dramas, we've seen radio dramas, you've seen culture start to explain and show and depict what coercive control is. And, I think we haven't yet seen that happen in Australia. The news can only show us so much. We need to be a fly on the wall. And what's happened in the UK is there's been a lot of television shows and radio dramas that have shown that. And so there's just a growing sense of what domestic abuse actually is. We've had it completely wrong for 40 years, not people in the sector, but people in the public. And the justice system has had a very masculine definition of what domestic violence is. And what we have to come back to is what women and children have been saying for 40 years, is that for a lot of them, the coercive control is the worst part.
You do important work, Jess Hill, and congratulations on the ongoing growing audience for your book, and thanks for your expertise tonight on The Drum.
Thank you, Julia.
Jess Hill, she's a journalist and author of See What You Made Me Do. Now, if this topic has raised any concerns for you at all, please call 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732.